I now give the floor to Mr. Mark Lowcock. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As you've heard me say many times before, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it's the place where we as the United Nations have our largest relief operation. More than 250 humanitarian agencies, most of them Yemeni, are working to deliver the UN response plan. Together, we're reaching more than 12 million people across the country every month. But as the aid operation has expanded, the drivers of the crisis have continued to get worse. In fact, it often feels in Yemen that the more we achieve, the bigger and more complicated the problem becomes. For more than a year, we have advocated progress on 5 key priorities. Firstly, the protection of civilians. Secondly, humanitarian access. Thirdly, funding for the aid operation. Fourth, support for the economy. And fifth, a political solution. So I would like to update you on where these issues now stand. Let me start with the protection of civilians. September was the deadliest month for civilians so far this year, with reports of 388 killed or injured due to conflict across the country. That's an average of 13 people every day. There are many gruesome examples. Last week, 4 children in Al Hudaydah were killed when unexploded ordnance from previous rounds of shelling detonated nearby. All 4 were from the same family. On 23 and 24 September, airstrikes killed 22 civilians in a mosque in Amran and a family home in Al Dali. And in Sada last week, airstrikes damaged a UN-supported water system that serves 12,000 people. That was the 4th time that facility had been hit since 2016. Now, as Martin will tell you when he briefs you, the situation on the violence in October is a little bit better. But with more than 30 active front lines, we can only hope that recent steps towards de-escalation, which Martin will brief you on again, will continue. I also continue to call for a nationwide ceasefire. And in parallel to these efforts, all parties must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, the second issue is humanitarian access, which remains extremely challenging, particularly in the north. Agencies there must still navigate more than 100 different restrictions imposed by Ansar Allah authorities, in addition to frequent harassment and attempts at interference. In September, Ansar Allah authorities effectively expelled or refused entry to several United Nations personnel, including a senior official. Movement restrictions remain severe as well. To cite one example, local authorities recently blocked humanitarian assessments in Hajjah and Hudaydah, where the authorities themselves tell us that more than 12,000 families have been affected by floods. We are engaging with Ansar Allah authorities in underlining our expectation that they will take action to improve the operating environment in accordance with the humanitarian principles. We have seen some progress, with dozens of blocked projects recently cleared to start, but many more projects remain pending. On a separate note, we hope recent discussions with Ansar Allah authorities will finally pave the way for a UN-led assessment of the decaying Safa oil tanker. This assessment is the first step in preventing a major potential environmental and humanitarian catastrophe in the Red Sea. The United Nations remains eager to assist with the Safa. It's entirely up to the Ansar Allah authorities whether we're able to do so. We have, of course, been here before. In the south, we're encouraged by reports, which Martin will set out in more detail, that talks between the government and the Southern Transitional Council are progressing. A renewal of hostilities in the south would put civilians in harm's way and impact humanitarian operations. Last month, several humanitarian organisations suspended activities in parts of Abyan and Shabwa as a result of clashes there. These programmes have now mostly resumed, but continue to face difficulties near front lines. The government has made substantial progress in clearing backlogs of pending humanitarian projects, with many recently approved to begin. But several other projects are still awaiting government clearance, which is delaying assistance for people who need it. Mr. President, the third point is funding for the aid operation. For much of this year, agencies struggled to raise enough money. Over the last few months, funding gaps forced key programmes to close. So I welcome the generous contributions which we have received in the past several weeks. At the General Assembly last month, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia gave the United Nations $500 million for the response plan, bringing their total contributions to this year's plan to $708 million. Earlier in September, the United Arab Emirates allocated $200 million to my office and the World Food Programme, bringing their total to $380 million. Other donors have also stepped forward. Kuwait has just given us $88 million. In the last 2 months, the United States, Germany, the European Commission and others have also given substantial additional funds on top of their earlier contributions. With hundreds of millions in new funding received over the last 6 weeks, the response plan has gone from 45% funded in early September to 65% funded today. Although substantial gaps remain, UN agencies have reopened many programmes that had been suspended, including support for health facilities, malnutrition treatment centres and vaccination campaigns. Other programmes should come back online soon. Mr. President, the fourth point is the economy. Last year, economic collapse pushed Yemen to the brink of widespread famine. So we should all be concerned that indicators are again pointing in this direction. The exchange rate is fluctuating at between 580 and 590 rial to the dollar. That's more than double the rate when conflict escalated 5 years ago. Because Yemen imports almost everything, consumer prices have also more than doubled, pushing basic goods out of reach for millions of people. So although there may be food in the market, fewer people can afford it. Now, 580 rial to the dollar is, of course, an improvement over the sustained 600 rial rate we'd seen for the last 6 weeks. And I want to commend the government of Yemen for their efforts to stabilise the exchange rate and to pay more civil servant salaries and strengthen the economy. But ultimately, those efforts cannot manoeuvre around a fundamental obstacle, the lack of foreign exchange. So I call on Yemen's partners to provide regular injections of foreign exchange at a scale that will keep the exchange rate stable and help return food and other commodity prices to more affordable levels. I also want to repeat my concern over the humanitarian impact of recent government regulations on commercial fuel imports, which have contributed to severe fuel shortages in many areas. Fuel is essential to transport food to markets, pump drinking water, and power sanitation systems. Nearly 3/4 of hospitals rely on fuel to provide care, and aid organisations need fuel for their work. Over the last several weeks, these regulations imposed by the government blocked commercial fuel imports from Hodeidah. Yesterday, however, we understand that the government cleared 8 vessels carrying the equivalent of more than a month of average fuel imports. Several of those vessels have started already sailing for Hodeidah. One of them arrived this morning. This is something I welcome. It is important to understand the central role of fuel in determining humanitarian need in Yemen and our ability to meet those needs. As severe shortages gripped many areas in recent weeks, fuel prices doubled or even tripled. Very quickly, this pushed the cost of food and drinking water, which many people already could not afford, to even higher prices. Without fuel, municipal water systems in 3 cities simply stopped working altogether, and others cut back services. Sanitation plants reduced operations. Large quantities of human, animal, and commercial waste accumulated in the streets, greatly exacerbating the risk of cholera and other diseases. Rising fuel prices also mean families are less likely to get help when they need it, because transport becomes simply unaffordable or unavailable. In some areas, the number of people reporting to health facilities over the last several weeks dropped by 50% because sick people couldn't get to the health facility. At the same time, mobile health teams struggled to reach patients where they are because the teams don't have fuel either. So, again, I welcome the step I've just announced towards more flexibility, but I also call on the government to manage commercial imports in a way that sustainably avoids exacerbating humanitarian needs. I also call on Ansar Allah authorities to avoid any steps that may worsen shortages or push prices higher. Everything possible has to be done to ensure that families are able to buy what they need to survive and to ensure that essential services can continue. So, Mr. President, the funding we've received for the response plan will allow humanitarian agencies to continue keeping millions of people alive. That is cause for optimism. But there's much more to do if our aim is not just to reduce people's suffering, but to end it altogether. The only way to achieve that is to stop the war. And I'm sure that that is what Martin is going to address now. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lowcock for his briefing.